Hello, everyone. Welcome to Rash's World. Today we have a special guest. We have Aamir Hussain. How are you doing?
Doing good, doing good.
Awesome.
Thank you
So
for
the
having me.
toughest question is first, how would you briefly describe yourself? What would you say?
Ah, yeah. So, I am. It's hard to. It's hard. Yeah, like you said, that's a hard question. It's like
Yeah.
I'm born in Pakistan. I grew up mostly in Saudi Arabia. I've been in Canada for a very long time. My day job is technology, but I have a lot of interests outside of that sphere of things. And I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a son, I'm a brother, all of those sorts of things, and they're all very important to me.
Awesome. There are also different roles that you're playing. And I have you written down as an IT guy, so that would be correct too. Author and IT guy.
Yes, IT guy is close enough.
Awesome. And we also have a novel. You're a writer, and your debut novel is Under the Full and Crescent Moon. And I'd really like to talk about that. So, what would you again say? What is this novel about? And then I'd like to dive into the discussion about it and on it as well.
Yeah. So I am in the end not a fiction author. I never imagined myself being a novelist. It's just that I had an idea and it had to be a story. And it's the story of a young woman growing up in a historical society that is a matriarchy, and it's also kind of compliant with Islamic law as much as I could make it. And I tried to do a really good job of doing that. Just because that was the idea that I had, was whether Islam as a faith, and I am a Muslim, is so rigid that it wouldn't be able to accommodate something like this. And that's something that I think most people think. Most people think of Islam as a very rigid faith, and certainly a misogynistic faith. And from my understanding of my own faith and the faith of the family that I grew up in, something like that should have been perfectly possible. And
Mhm.
so I dug into it, and from what I could tell, Islam is not as rigid a philosophy as people make it out to be, and something even as unusual as a matriarchy should be perfectly possible. And that is the genesis of the idea, and it became a story of this young woman growing up in that society and then having to defend it when more traditional, as we think of it, understanding of Islam try to assert themselves into that place.
Mhm. I find it fascinating that you're setting it in the Islamic Golden Age, and for me, that's a really important, crucial point too. And this is like what we're talking about here, rigidity and so on, and that exists. I think religion exists on a spectrum as well, where you can go in different directions and too far or too liberal in some ways as well. But I think like what's interesting then, because that's like really the beginning of trying to figure things out. And from what I know, and you've done research for this book, which is amazing, but from what I know, this was a time of flux where people would state their opinions. People would actually have debates, and it was encouraged to state your opinion and to talk about it. So there's like an openness there that, again, existed and was in a time of where they were at their height of also knowledge of the intellectual capacities, talking about things, about literature, and debating things. So is that again what you're showing at this crucial point of time in history as well?
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, the Islamic Golden Age isn't the perfect way of describing anything, because there's like a lot of different Islamic empires, a lot of
Mhm.
different Muslim communities over the centuries. Some of them did well, and some of them didn't do well. And so, what exactly is the Islamic Golden Age is, I think, up to debate. But that you're definitely right is that initially, um, the things that kind of crystallize and what
Mhm.
we think of as traditional Islam now. And it's certainly traditional, it's normative, it's how most people perceive of Islam. It kind of settled into its current patterns at around the end of the period where I set the novel. And that allowed me to be able to have these debates before things got formalized, because these four Sunni schools of law, they didn't exist in the earliest Islamic communities. They kind of came into being about 250, 300 years after
Mhm.
Islam really started spreading. And that is the time where I said it, just so that I could have that openness. And certainly, people have debates nowadays as well. And there's nothing in there's nothing in the book that I put in there. And there's a lot of debates. There's a lot of characters that have back and forth about what it means to be a Muslim, what Islam really wants from people. There's nothing in there that is novel. These are all
Mhm.
debates that people argue about right now
Mhm.
online
Mhm.
or between scholars constantly.
Yeah.
So all of those kind of debates are happening right now. But in that period of history, the kind of formal schools of law that we're used to now, they didn't exist at that point. They were just
Mhm.
beginning to form, and that allowed me to like play with those sorts of things.
Exactly. And that's what I'm referring to. It's not crystallized yet into anything, right? So there's so much potential there. And it's
Yes.
like you're presenting a vision that's like this could be it. I kind of like this could be maybe another path. And I find that interesting with history too. It's like you have various choices and then we take a certain path and just kind of to play with that idea. But also the idea of also fatwas. And I was like interested to find out. This is like the perception we have is
Mhm.
like death sentences, basically, which is again, that's not what it's all about. So maybe you can talk about the process of fatwas and what they inherently like were designed to do, especially in their time.
Yeah. So I mean, again, that was another part of it because definitely after September 11th, 2001, the image of Islam and the image of Muslims really changed, and it's
Mhm.
changed pretty dramatically. I mean, I've been in Canada since 1996,
Mhm.
so it really felt different to me from 1996 to 2001. From 2001 onwards, it was a very different sort of approach that non-Muslims had towards Muslims, and essentially something that basically has become, and I think it was probably there before too, but muted. But anything in Arabic or anything even vaguely Islamic is evil, right? Like Sharia,
Mhm.
fatwas,
Mhm.
all of those sorts of things are seen as being barbaric, backwards, regressive, and all of those sorts of things. So I actually took that seriously because, like I said, I did grow up in Saudi Arabia. So especially in the early 80s and the 90s, because I'm getting up there, I'm pretty old. But that's when I grew up. In that time, a lot of the stereotypes of what you would think of Islam being misogynistic, women not being allowed to drive, women not being allowed to go outside, women being forced to cover themselves, that was true in the society, in the country that I grew up in. But in my family, that wasn't true at all, right? So I was always very comfortable with the idea of there being a lot of different understandings of Islam, a lot of different versions of Islam. But in the Western conception after 9/11, especially, it became a monolith. It became like, oh, Islam is this one thing. And everything Islamic, Quran, jihad, fatwas, all of those sorts of things, they're just evil. They're barbaric. This is the problem with them. This is why they are incompatible with Western values, all of those sorts of things. And so, obviously, um, at that time, I mean, like, and I think this is true, most Muslims don't think about you know, fatwas and muftis and all of that
Mhm.
sort of stuff at
Right.
all. For
Yeah.
us, generally speaking, all of these things are kind of like what most people in the West would think of the Ten Commandments, right? It's like
Mhm.
nobody knows what the sixth commandment is, but if somebody says, "Hey, do you think the Ten Commandments are a good idea?" People say, "Yeah, generally, yeah." I mean, it could just be a good person, no murder, no all of those sorts of things.
Mhm.
And that's basically what most Muslims just think about all of this sort of Islamic law, Sharia business is that it's generally a good thing and there's nothing wrong. In fact, it's a good thing to have that be a part of Western society. Why not, right? Like the Ten Commandments are a good thing, Sharia is a good thing. But that's definitely not what the view of any of it is. And so when I dug into it, it turned out to be very boring. Like honestly,
Mhm.
I looked into what fatwas actually are, what muftis actually do, and all of those sorts of things. And it's not very interesting. I mean, like it's interesting for people who are really into, legal processes and procedures.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
basically, it's nothing more than if you have a question about correct behavior, and it doesn't have to be legal correct behavior. It could be even like how to pray, but it can be something that is legal, like how do you have inheritance and all of those sorts of things. You just have a question about correct behavior. So who do you go to? You go to somebody who
Mhm.
is learned, in these sorts of things, and you ask them a question, and then they answer the question, and that's pretty much all a fatwa is. It's like you went to somebody who presumably knows what they're talking about, and hopefully there's some credential system, but different societies did it in different ways. You go to a mufti, they answer your question. And if it's a question that has legal implications, then in a lot of Islamic societies, that fatwa actually had legal weight, and you could take it to a court, and then a judge would actually rule based on those fatwas. And that was it, right? And like
But
obviously there's
they're
criticism.
non-binding, right? From what I was looking at, they're non-binding. And so in a sense also it's an expert, but it's an opinion. And I think that's
Yep,
like I don't speak Arabic, but that's like the root seems to give an opinion. And the thing
yep,
is, you can have a second opinion, the same way we go to doctors, like, well, I want to talk to somebody else to figure this out. So in a
yep.
way, because it's an opinion, it's also debatable to an extent where you can say, let's talk about opinions, right? It's an opinion
Mhm.
if you use that. It's based on, of course, like concrete evidence, but there could be all other opinions as well, is my point. So I find that interesting because it's not like that said binding this you have to do, right? So and that space I think is really important to preserve that. So there can be again that discussion that you're talking about.
Yeah, and in the end, like it's just an answer to a question.
Hmm.
It's a qualified answer to a question, but you take it, and in the end, when it becomes like a legal, when it overlaps with the legal system, because every society has some sort of a system of law and order, and has some sort of a legal process. In those societies, basically, you could have competing fatwas. You could have like in
Hmm.
my novel that
Hmm.
happens a fair bit, where basically there's
Right.
fatwas about the same exact topic,
Yeah.
and the two competing muftis have completely different opinions. But then it's up to like a judge to have to balance all of that sort of stuff,
Hmm. Yeah,
right?
balance. Yeah.
So yeah, and it's nowadays since there's no legal system that uses fatwas in the world today. It's all very basically Western. Laws are passed by politicians, and a very what is familiar to us in the West. That's just what happens everywhere. So fatwas and the looseness of the fatwa system doesn't exist anywhere, and now it's just purely a matter of um, personal, like the original questions that you had for fatwas is like, well, what time, what day of the week is good to cut your toenails? Like to
Hmm.
take a somewhat silly example, but that's important to some people, right? So when you're going back to like whether Islam is rigid or not, for some people, I think if you want Islam to be rigid, it can be. There's a lot of ways, there's a lot of schools of thought that have a lot of answers to pretty much any question that you would want, and very defined ways of getting more answers, right?
Hmm.
And you can definitely have a very structured existence, and that is perfectly possible within Islam. But does it have to be, right?
Hmm.
And by putting this novel into that earlier time where things hadn't been formalized, things hadn't been crystallized, I was able to bring in like, and actually, this is what happened. Which sources are important for fatwas, right?
Hmm.
And the Quran is always there for Muslims. The Quran is the core document, and everybody agrees on that.
Hmm.
But do you take the sayings of the Prophet and the sayings of the Prophet's companions to be um, sources of law or sources of answers just as important as the Quran? And that is where there was definitely a debate, and there's a debate nowadays, but there was definitely a debate during that time where the use of the sayings of the Prophet kind of spread. And so this society is a place where, and this is historical. I took a lot of actually inspiration from ancient Andalusia, where these this idea of having the hadith, it's called the sayings of the prophet, and the sayings of the prophets, and the sayings and the actions of the prophet's companions, which was recorded by later historians, having them be a very, very important source of law is something that spread. And it became uh, completely formalized, and it became like, yes, the hadith are as important a source of law as the Quran, is something that is what we are used to in traditional Sharia. But in this period, that hadn't been formalized. And so in this society, that use of the hadith as a source of law is coming in to the
Hmm. Hmm.
coming into the picture. And the older, more conservative way you would think of doing it is to not have the Hadith as a source of law and just have the Quran and other sources.
hmm Yeah, and
So
that's fascinating. And if we put it in the modern times, how would like, would it be like accommodating with technology and all the modern views of things, or do you still stick to the traditions? And that's a question I'd be curious to ask you is what, or should they be again also kind of like adjusting to the modern times? I mean, just to in the Bible, there's so much that you can choose and pick from. There's actually opposites of things, and you can either one is mentioned. But if you look also in terms of like legally, like because again, that could be a legal basis there too. The Constitution can also be like adjusted to like, okay, well, when we talked about this, this was back then, and this is now. And so, are you open to that kind of a bit of openness to move tradition and to adjust to certain modern trends?
well, I mean, I would not have written the story of a Muslim matriarchy if I wasn't very open. It,
That's right.
in that, in personally, in that that spectrum of rigid, basically, let's say traditional to progressive, I'm very much closer to the progressive end of things,
Mhm, mhm,
and I am very, and again, I think it's because of my personal upbringing in the family that I was brought up in. There was no rigidity in faith. It was something that me and my sister were actually encouraged to just figure things out for ourselves,
mhm,
especially as an immigrant family. Our immigrant, the every immigrant family has a different philosophy. But what our parents told my sister and I was, okay, you're going to a new place, take the best of what you had, and take the best of the new place, and
mhm.
combine them for yourself. So
Right.
that is something that kind of flexibility and that kind of lack of control over what we were doing, I think helped both my sister and I come up with our own answers to a lot of the questions. And for us, a lot of the answers remained like, yeah, the traditional faiths, the Quran, and all of these sorts of things come in and are very important to us. But there's a lot of things in the West as well that we like the individualism, the respect for personal liberty, which and that means a lot of things in a lot of different fields. It's not just it's gender, women's rights, and a lot of different things that the West has to offer now, which our traditional societies don't, were also things that we incorporated into our own identity, into our own personal philosophies, and our own. I think for me, my approach to faith in the end is that I don't know. Like I'm not God. Like the
Mhm,
people who make like very rigid pronouncements about like, well, this is Islamic and this is not Islamic, and you do this and you're going to hell is like something that I've never understood because it seems very arrogant to me. To
mhm,
say that like I know what's best in the end, whether God exists or not. If God exists and God is real, then God is going to decide who was a good person and who wasn't a good person.
mhm,
It's
mhm,
not going to be us, right? So all of that to say, um, I really feel that for me, Islam is not rigid. Islam and how that is also, as a South Asian, as somebody who grew up in a Pakistani culture and in a South Asian culture, there's a lot of aspects of the traditional faith that I have that is different from the traditional faith of somebody who grew up in Iran or somebody who grew up in Saudi Arabia or somebody who grew up in Indonesia. Because in all of these different places, Islam is there and Islam is incredibly important in all of these places. But the original culture of the regions that we came from is also there.
mhm,
And it's also present and also means that we eat different things when we break our fasts, right? So that is important to me because that it makes the modern kind of approach that a lot of Muslims have, which is that you have to act exactly like seventh century Arabia,
mhm,
is something that never made sense to me because it wasn't true for South Asian Islam until the rise of the modern internet, until the world got smaller, until you started having telephones and telegrams and especially satellite dishes and internet. Each region of the world kind of did its own thing, and it's only now when we have so much interconnectedness that and this idea that everybody has to act exactly the same has become, I think, very prevalent. And I think that I think that's a mistake. I think that
Mhm.
there is um, the fact that there isn't that much religious text in English, for example, in a lot of different ways. We have plenty of translations of the Quran and everything like that, but the fact that there isn't like a Canadian version of Islam or
Mhm.
a South American version of Islam is something that it's a shame, right? I mean, like, it's something that happened in the past. It's something that happened in history all the time because there was no other option, right? I mean, like you only came to Hajj once in your lifetime if you were lucky, and other than that, everything about your local version of Islam was very similar to your neighbors. Like in South Asia, there was a lot of interconnectedness between the local South Asian faiths and Islam, right? And People were still Muslim. People still believed in the Quran, and the most important parts of Islam were there. The core of Islam was there, but you had different approaches to like wedding rituals were different,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, and all of those sorts of things. And that's been lost. And that's been lost because technology has made it possible for it to be lost. But that still means I still think that's a mistake. Like just because technology makes it so that everybody can uh, get the exact same rigid approach, which some central person in, I don't know, Egypt or Saudi Arabia says, well, this is how everybody should behave. And now that can get broadcast around the world in like a split second with the speed of light. Islam was perfectly fine before that could happen.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I think there was a little bit of the baby that was thrown out with the technological
Yeah.
advances where um, having Islam be able to adjust because Islam from my perspective, honestly, and I'm rambling here, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
that's fine. No, keep going.
But from my perspective, Islam is very clear, and it has very clear principles, but it is not, to my mind, narrow. You know, in the Quran, there is a phrase that's repeated all the time, the Sirat al-Mustaqim, which is a straight path, right?
Mhm.
And I don't think it's a narrow path. I think it's a straight path, and the principles of the Quran are very clear about justice and equality and a lot of the things that are completely compatible with Western liberalism, for example, because it came out way before Western liberalism.
Mhm. That is true.
Um,
Yes.
and it's completely compatible with all of that. But then a lot of the other things that are added on from a culture perspective, because well, this is how this is how my grandparents did it, or this is because this other source of law says that you have to do things this way. If those things, if you step back from all of those things, the principles of the Quran are the same everywhere, but they're not as controlling as they, I think, seem to be for many people,
Yeah.
both in the faith and outside the faith.
And I love what you're saying because there's this creative mix because you're bringing your own culture, your own food, your own traditions to it. And of course, it's going to color that and change that slightly, but the core is still the same. And to be able to again, like you're free to wear whatever you want, for example, that kind of, so everyone is still like the same, but it looks slightly different. There is a unique feeling to it related to that tradition, which I think is great. But one of the other things that you're mentioning and that also interests me here is female agency and talking about strong women in your life as well, and how this is also like philosophically important to have that. And what is your novel saying about female agency? And again, why did you specifically write that in that time period, in that tradition to talk about this? A very important issue.
Yeah, no. And one of the classic attacks on Islam has always been it's a very misogynistic religion, right? It's it's just it's just a standard talking point, and it comes and goes sometimes, but it's always there and it always comes up. And for me, it never in my family it never was. In my family, the women in my family are um I mean, it would be an understatement to say that they're as accomplished as the men. But the men in my family are perfectly fine as well. But
Mhm.
I've got like doctors, engineers, artists, other computer professionals, and all of them, any field that you can imagine. I have grown up watching the women in my family excel in all of those fields. So for me, it was just a completely natural thing to have women be in leadership positions, but not in the popular conceptions of Islam and not in the country that I grew up in. So having this idea that the Quran doesn't prevent a women-led society from happening, and looking at the situation at a time period in history where the formal schools of law hadn't crystallized. I I was able to create a society that was in compliance with the understanding of Islamic law of this imagined society. Now, whether they're actually good Muslims or not is something that's not for me to
Mhm.
say. That's for God to say. And I don't think God cares about my imaginary characters either. But the I wanted to I think there's two things. First off, I wanted to kind of showcase the kind of women that I grew up with, right? And
Mhm.
like bring their presence out. Because I think when you say that Islam is a very controlling religion and a very misogynistic religion, then the experience of all of these pious women who are not controlled and who are not living in a misogynistic reality, that their existence is just completely erased. It's as if my sister doesn't exist. It's as if my mother doesn't
Mhm.
exist. It's as if
Yeah.
my neighbors or the people I went to university with or the people that I work with, they just don't exist because either you are completely controlled or you're not pious. And I know just because of how I grew up and the family I grew up in, I know plenty of these people and they just don't exist and their voices aren't there. So for me, it was also an important thing to show them in the novel. And actually, there's a reason why the main character is named Khadija, because that is a reference to one of the most important women in early Islamic history. And the other two main characters are named Fatima and Aisha. And those are two other references to two other women in Islamic history that are just giants and that they are well loved by everybody. And well, not well, they are, and it was very important for me to have those references. They're obviously not the same as those characters, but Khadija, Aisha, Fatma, these are very common names in Muslim communities for a reason because these characters are so well loved. And it was very important for me to have them be friends and not be on the same side. And so that is a reference to not only female agency and references to all these very powerful and very accomplished women in Islamic history, but also kind of a, a, a reference to my hope that there's a lot of inter-Muslim tensions
Mhm.
that are there, and it it just feels like we're being divided and conquered all the time. And so to have these three women be friends in my story was very important to me to not only show female agency, but also to show that there's a why can't Muslims themselves get along and have these friendly discussions with each other instead of having them become like very passionate and be very divisive kind of
Mhm. Mhm.
arguments.
Is it possible to take control of one's fate? Is one of the questions I also had. Would you say because in a way, when we have fate, it's something that's kind of ordained, and so how would you take control of it? So this is something that's also touched upon. So is that something that's possible in your view?
I believe I believe as a pious Muslim, I believe that everything happened according to God's will, but I also believe in free will.
Hmm.
So I believe because we have free will, we have the ability to make choices, and
Hmm.
our choices is what determines our fate. I mean, that's very important to me to have like that personal accountability and that personal kind of um, understanding of our own responsibility. Because yeah, what does God want us to do? Or to put it in a more secular way, what is the right way of behaving? What is the just way of behaving? And that doesn't have to be a religious thing, but as a religious person, the idea of like doing the right thing and doing the just thing and doing what God wants us to do, for me, is the one and the same. I believe in a God that's just. I believe in a God that's humane. I believe in a God that wants us to do right by ourselves and do right by our neighbors and do right by all the people of the world. And unless we've been given the ability to define our own fate, then what is the purpose of life?
Hmm.
You know?
I remember reading, I'm an incurable romantic. I remember reading Layla Majnun, and so basically
Mhm.
the other Romeo and Juliet, and so I found that very interesting because there's a passage where it says about that same thing that it's like there's a page on one side things are written, but the other side is blank. so that we can add to it. But certain things are there, but it's still on the same page. So there is certain freedom that we have, and of course free will, but there are also certain things that are not within our control, which is how I perceive things, that kind of the balancing act between the two.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And there's so much, and a part of how that comes about for me is we can do so much. I mean, like we have so
Mhm.
much agency,
That's
like
right.
we were talking, and I think agency has been like an important thing of
Mhm.
what we've been talking about. But in the end, there's so much luck and fortune involved too. Involves too.
Yeah.
Like like there's something that I'm struggling with is the fact that we're here living in like very comfortable lives, and we're able to pursue our dreams, and we're able to have like these amazing discussions with each
Yeah.
other. Um, but that's just there's so much luck involved in that because we could have been born
Mhm.
in like a warm foreign region, right?
Mhm.
So that's just that part was not under our control.
Mhm.
Like we are lucky in a lot of ways, and we're fortunate in a lot of ways.
But it's
And
also with agency because then we have people, in my case also parents, who decided to leave that place and go to another place. And it's kind
yeah,
of like a mix of, but you need that support too. I maybe call it cosmic support to get through all of this. So yes, I think it's both. I think it's definitely both.
mhm.
Yeah.
It's definitely, but then you have to be aware of both of those things. And I
Yes,
think that gives you like
absolutely.
the healthy perspective, that healthy
Yeah.
perspective that, um, we are able to make our own choices, but we're also kind of beholden to a lot of different things that are outside of our control. And we
That's right.
should be able to give ourselves the grace that, like, oh, okay, you know what? Maybe, one thing that's on my mind is like, how many people will find out about the book? Will it do well? Will it not do well? But, I'm doing what I can.
Mhm.
And I think just getting to this point um, is very gratifying that I was able to get to this point. And if it doesn't do well, then it's fine. It's like I did what I could and I did what I did. What
Yeah,
other people do is very much outside of my control. So I
exactly.
should be able to give myself the grace to say, you know what? I did a lot and we'll see what happens. But I was able to meet a lot of people, and some people are already reading my book and putting in reviews, and they're very kind. And
Nice.
it's just even touching one other person
Yes.
is a gift in and of itself.
So would you agree with the statement, the pen is mightier than the sword?
Oh, I think in the long run, the pen is mightier than the sword.
Yes.
In the short term, like if you're like faced with like, and I, it comes to me like the quote from Rafat al-Harir, the Palestinian poet, who wrote basically like one of the things that I recently wrote was his collection of poetry and prose. Um, and I don't think that this is in there, but I read a quote of him before he was basically killed in an Israeli airstrike. He said that if I'm an English teacher, I'm not a warrior. All I have is my marker, and I'm paraphrasing here. Like, but if like IDS soldiers burst into my room, I would throw my marker at them as my last act. You know.
Mhm.
So in the long run, I really believe that the pen is mightier than the sword. But we're living in a time where, in the short term, the swords are very, very the swords are very, very scary right now. Like they come out of the sky and then they can like target you with it. So, and I think it's on us as people who enjoy letters and people who read and write and all of those sorts of things to make sure that in the long run, the pen overcomes.
And as my final question, what made you pick up that pen and again choosing your writing career? Because you said this kind of came as a surprise, but you do have a novel now. So let's talk about what you said. You had an idea. What was that about? And how did the process? How would you describe the process of writing and putting a book together? Which is not easy, I can tell from experience as well.
Yeah, 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 no, for sure. So like I said, I had the attacks on Islam that I took very seriously. And honestly, if I had found something different in my researches, then I could very well be an ex-Muslim today. And there's plenty of people in my family who are ex-Muslims, and that's like I said, my family, even my extended family, um, is very um, supportive of people finding their own faith and people finding their own philosophies. But I didn't do that, right? So for me, when I did my research, I found plenty of things in the faith that I was born in that was of value, and I stayed Muslim. And all of those things came together in the idea like, why couldn't there be a Muslim matriarchy? And then when I had that idea and I did all my research and learned about what Islamic law, the process of Islamic law, and all of those sorts of things, and all of those scary Arabic words, actually mean, I felt a desire to communicate those. And I could have written like a blog post, blogs had started to be a thing. Like, and I could have written a blog post and nobody would have read it. That's one
Yeah.
thing. But the other thing is that in order to really convey it, I was always been a reader.
Mhm.
I've been a voracious reader since I was a kid.
Good.
So I've read a lot of different things. I think mostly fantasy and science fiction. So, not Rumi and not 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 Russian philosophers or anything like that. But um, I've always been incredibly aware and in awe of the power of story.
Mhm.
So because all that research and this random idea I had about like can there be a Muslim matriarchy, it turned into the story of a young woman growing up in one of those places.
Mhm.
And once that was settled into my brain, then I kind of had to do it. And so there was a lot of research involved, of course, first. And then there's a lot of research as you keep on going too, because it's impossible not to have a lot of research, just because every question, every plot point, every world setting detail, you kind of want to do a good job of it. So
Mhm.
especially when you said it, since I said it in like a kind of like a historical period,
Yeah.
I had to go keep on doing the research and try to put in details that were at least believable, right?
Mhm.
So there was a lot of research that went into it. And then before I actually started writing my novel, I did find a very supportive online circle of short story writers, and I wrote a lot of short stories. I wrote a lot of short stories, and I got a lot of feedback from them. Those are the two most important things, I think, when you're starting out. You find a place where you write and you um, get feedback. And because I was able to get the feedback, I was able to like figure out my voice, figure out what was working and what
Mhm.
was not working, what my strengths are and what my weaknesses are.
Mhm.
And then when I finally started to write stories that weren't getting like the kind of comments like, well, this is clunky, I didn't make sense, I don't know what you're trying to say here. When I stopped having those kind of comments, I felt like, you know what? Unless I start writing this, it's never going to happen.
Mhm.
And the other thing that I did, like I said, my the kind of stories that I read growing up were very like 80s and 90s kind of like nerdy things like science fiction and fantasy, Lord of the Rings, and there's like a lot of fantasy. There's a lot of genre literature out there, and those are the things that I grew up reading. But when I realized that I had to set it at like a very certain time in history, I started reading historical novels
Mhm.
just to
Yeah.
get the sense of that. And from there, once I did that as well as all my other research. I I outlined very, very thoroughly exactly what I wanted to happen because I had like a very sense of like good sense of what the final conflict would be, who the characters would be, and um, I started filling in the details. I started filling in
Mhm.
the details, and it was a long process. It was a long process. I'm not going to lie because there's a lot of life changes that happened in the way. I would not have been able to do this without the support of my wife, of course. And I had like a commute. This was pre-COVID because this was like a long time coming.
Yeah.
Pre-COVID, I had a commute, and I did a lot of research on the subway, and I did a lot of my writing on the GO train.
Yeah.
Um, so I took advantage of that time as much as I could. But I'll be honest, there was a lot of times where I stopped writing
Mhm.
for a long, long stretches of time. But um, I once I got serious about it, and once I got serious about giving myself like a word count total per day, then slowly but surely, I got through my outline, I got through the milestones, I got through the various um, uh, different plot hurdles that I had set up for my characters and all of that sort of stuff. And it got done. Like, it's like
Mhm. Yes.
I it was like eating a mountain, but how do you eat a mountain? You do it one bite at a time. So,
Because of the delicate nature of it and complex nature of your novel, and again, including religion and especially Islam, did you find yourself
mhm.
second guessing certain parts, or just thinking like how like would the reader, would the public react to this, or did you just say, I'm just gonna do my own thing and I don't really care, or was there maybe a bit of both in there?
I think it's a bit of both. I
Yeah.
think it's a bit of both, but I I knew that I was doing something that was unusual. And I
Yeah.
know that there's like and here's the thing, like I am not going to come here and say like, oh, socially conservative Muslims and traditional Muslims are wrong and I'm right and everybody should be like me or anything like that. That
Mhm.
is to me like at a height of arrogance. And like, I don't like it when they do that. I don't like it when progressive Muslims or like, there's like a lot of different competing philosophies and they all like shouting at each other,
Yeah.
like a lot of interdenominational tensions.
Hmm.
I don't like any of that.
Hmm.
But I did know that I was doing something that a lot of people wouldn't appreciate. Um, but for me, it was for one thing, I'm used to having like kind of like out there ideas and like defending them, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah,
So
of
this was
course.
just that at a grander scale. At a
Yeah.
grander scale, I was doing the same thing. So that's just my personality. And the other thing I think is that I think more important than my personal view or the view of like again, like the characters have their own faith. There are, you know, there's like different characters that have different understandings of Islam. And in the novel, who's right or who's wrong, who can say? But more important to me than having, okay, this interpretation is better than this interpretation, and these sources of the law should be above these other sources of law, or all of these other sorts of things. For me, it's the important thing is an appreciation for diversity. Like if we just say to each other, like, okay, look, you have this view, and there's like a lot of different, like, you know, there's four different Sunni schools of law. There's a lot of different kind of Shias, and a lot of different, even within Shia Islam, there's a lot of different schools of thought or strains of thought about everything. Wouldn't it be much better if we could just like have a conversation about it over coffee instead of um, fighting over it and getting very um, aggressive about it?
Hmm.
Because it feels to me, and this is a conspiracy theory, of course, but it feels to me that a lot of the inter-Muslim violence that happens, and there's a lot of that happening in the world today right now as well, it seems to be there's a very little fire there, and outside forces are just throwing fuel on them for their own benefits and their own ends. And by me uh, jumping into that conversation, what I want to say more than anything else, like I might be wrong, I might be right, but let's just have a talk about it.
Hmm.
And in the end, we can agree to disagree as well, right? Because
Hmm.
if I'm wrong, if I'm very wrong, and the traditional Muslim person is very right, then God will take care of it on the day of judgment, you know?
Hmm. Hmm.
And you know, he can, and that person can go at me afterwards at that time. And if it's not true, and I'm very aware of the idea that I might be wrong, and there's nothing after it, and the atheists are right, then it doesn't matter anyway. It'll all just end. So while we have this life, why are we fighting over these sorts of things when we could fight for justice instead?
Yeah.
You know?
And as you talk about this, I was thinking of interfaith marriage, and I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, right? But I
Hmm.
like the idea of like, well, here you are together and figure out something together, maybe as a couple, for life. Hopefully, it doesn't go wrong, but again, there's that the danger too, where it might not work in many cases.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. And actually, interfaith marriage is a big plot point in the novel as well,
Yes.
with the exact same debate about whether it's a good thing or not a good thing. And also in, you know, the traditional interpretations of Islam, men have more agency than women do. Um, uh, so that's actually a part of the novel as well. But I know plenty of people who are ignoring that injunction and have interfaith marriages where the woman is Muslim and the man is not, and the man didn't convert, and they're and some of those marriages are going just fine. But on the other hand, I know of marriages which just everything is identical, like the same kind of family, the same kind of
Yeah.
culture, everything's the same, and those marriages didn't work out. So
Yeah. Exactly.
it's so hard to say. It's so
Yeah.
hard to say, and there's so many other things involved rather than just the culture of the two people involved.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you
Yeah.
so much for an awesome discussion. So Amir Hussain, your book is Under the Full and Crescent Moon, and it's going to be available next month, I
Yes.
think. Yeah,
September in Canada, September end of September in Canada, and October in the States, I think is the official launch date.
wonderful. Best of luck. Hopefully, it's not your first and only novel. I'm looking forward to others too, but we're going to get started with this and wish you best of luck with this one.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a wonderful talk.
Thank you.